with Tayo Oyegunle, who is the VP for Global Operations at Cabal 360, and Leonard Ebute has just joined us. Leonard is a Nigeria Country Manager for Lorry Systems. Thanks for joining us, guys. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me here, Tomiwa, and the team.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. Seems like there's a little bit of a delay, but we'll try to make the best of that. I'm looking forward to an interesting chat. So I don't know if you guys have followed sort of the keynote and the sessions prior to this, but we've been talking a little bit about sort of the opportunities in the current moment. And I think Kola and Amanda had a fascinating conversation about sort of where the landscape is today. I'm going to run down a few of those points because there's some of the themes that I want us to discuss today. Okay. And then I'm going to ask each of you to speak specifically to some of the things that you're seeing from your perspective. For those who don't know, Cabal 360 and Lorry Systems are two of the most interesting companies currently in the supply chain conversation. They apply tech to the movement of goods across the continent, and they starting from different sections of the continent. So Lorry Systems started in East Africa, Cabal started in West Africa. They're both crossing territories right now and competing in interesting ways. But overall, I think they're both companies that are doing really interesting things, and sort of that sector, this application of tech to traditional sectors is one of the most important sort of like trends in the digital space and in the tech space for the future. Just speaking about taking a long-term view of the ecosystem, but then the short-term things that need to get built. I think Kola talked about the men who built America, and these guys built railways, they built power, they built the infrastructure that America runs on today. And I think the interesting thing about Africa is that we've gone decades, maybe even centuries, without building that infrastructure as it's been built across the rest of the world. So what's interesting, and where the sort of immediate opportunity, what it seems to me that COVID and 2020 as a whole, the beast that it is forcing onto the continent, is this reckoning with, we haven't built these things, and we have to build them now. We have to build them really, really quickly, because if we don't build them, the things that will come on top of them, if you don't have power, how will people sort of build successful businesses? If you don't have telco infrastructure, how will people be able to sort of like partake in this digital revolution that is happening? If you don't have logistics within the continent, then how do you supply goods intra-continent? There are a number of sort of trends that are accelerating on a global basis, so across the continent, including things like sort of the Africa Free Trade Act, which says, you know, we are going to trade more within the continent. We are going to sort of exchange goods and services amongst ourselves, not just with the rest of the world. But if we don't build the infrastructure for that, how does that happen? And I think that's really the opportunity for sort of the smartest tech companies today, is for them to be building the services on which the future will be built on. So Leo, I want you to talk a little bit about sort of what you're seeing from the perspective of Lorry Systems in terms of the movement of goods, in terms of your health as a business, in terms of what your clients are doing, in terms of what governments are doing right now. Like, what does the ecosystem and what does the world look like from where you guys are sitting? Leo?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for having me, everyone here. The essence of Lorry System is anchored on the fact that logistics is going anywhere, whether good times or bad times. People and food will move around. It is how they move around that may change. Those variations will come as people in situations, changing infrastructure, changing regulations, and all that. Okay. So the outlook for logistics is, in the time of COVID, logistics was protected by every country in the world. We were essential service. Okay. Of course, unfortunately, some of our clients were able to move their products around because they weren't considered essential. But then we saw an upsurge that provided essential services. From a cargo availability point of view, we didn't see any major change in terms of the absolute volume. What we did see is in the terms of number of locations from which we can do business. So that said, the outlook looks great. The case for tech-enabled logistics has also been well established before COVID, but then it was revalidated by COVID. in that in Nigeria, for example, from where the bulk of logistics is, the bulk of truck ownership is in the traditional ownership, individuals owning one or two trucks, unorganized, informal, and all that. The established truck owners aren't that many. As a matter of fact, my personal calculation is that all the big guys put together accounts for maybe 10% of the total truck ownership in Nigeria. So the vista for those of us in the tech to that broad untapped pool into the pool of logistics available to service our clients who are suffering as a result of this is really, really huge. So we made that case very strongly. The traditional guys couldn't navigate the changing regulations, the permits to move around and all of those things that COVID brought about. But we had the size, we had the connect to get all that done. And so we saw them start reaching out to us more. And so the challenge for us is that, like I said, we still have a lot of huge car clients and cargo. The supply side saw the need for the proposition. We've always tried to see the same value proposition that has been sold to the demand side long before now. And so we are seeing this opportunity, time for us to rise and to eat from an unleavened pie, okay? When there is a chance to live in that pie, get it bigger, and then compete on what portion of the much, much bigger pie we can all feed from. And that is in harnessing the potentials of the industry to move the traditional setup into a more tech-enabled digital setup from which we can provide service to both sides, the transporter and the client on the both side, on the other side.
Fair enough. I think that's really interesting, Leonard. Tayo, I mean, how are things looking on your end? I like the conversation around what was considered essential or is being considered essential services versus what isn't considered essential services. What impact has that had on sort of your business, on sort of the volumes you're seeing? What changes are you seeing in the landscape?
So I think, essential to also strip the industry out into the demand side and into the supply side of the business. So today on the demand side, right, we've seen mixed results. And like Leonard said, right, like essentials, we've seen just, stability and a pickup. So I think it's important, number one, that, people move around, right, and food moves around to people, right, especially in this time that people can go out. So we've seen an uptick there, right, and the FMCG space accounts for a huge chunk of our business today. So it's been interesting to see, how much more of the government has begun to appreciate the value of logistics and moving things around, right? Beyond production, right? The key question is, how do you get things around? And so even besides, all of the lockdown and all of this that happened, I think there's been just key emphasis from the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria that things have to get around, that people have to move. Even they can't make money every day, right, based on the way the economy is structured today, things have to move. Also in the pharmaceutical space, we've also seen, just interesting traction there. I think that's driven by the fact that, of course, there's huge demand now for, drugs and so on, because people are trying to stay more healthy, trying to make sure that they have, good habits. On the non-essential side, especially in the construction and building material space, we've seen some slowdown there. That's in terms of production and also on the classification side. The other thing that's happened there is that we think that broadly, business have cut down on capex, and so that has kind of slowed down broadly. And the port business side, which is the big one for us, we also noticed that there have been delays in imports, right? Actually, we saw just 40% of volumes of imports kind of delayed at the port. So that's held back, production for some of the businesses that we serve. And so that business hasn't been, fully forthcoming. But I understand now that as other economies have opened up, like, in China and Europe, we're seeing just a huge backlog of goods that were ordered being shipped into the country. So we expect to see a pickup there. So it's been mixed by sector, but FMCG, right, which contains broadly food and beverages, has been quite strong. There's been huge demand for fulfillment along that side. On the supply side of the business, right, we've seen three things happen there. At the beginning, right, we saw just a slowdown in movement across the country. So it was taking, number one to 2 extra days to move things around, right, the country, especially up country from the west of Nigeria. We also saw that there were a few, fees that were being layered on top of, traditional transporters fees, and that was being, we tried to pass that on to the shippers, right, saying that, it's not normal business as usual because there are more fees that are being layered on at borders. We also engaged in, with the government and tried to speak to them about this thing, that there wasn't just clear communication on what exactly like essential to non-essential meant, especially for people that are going to pick up. So we saw some pressure there. I think with just consistent engagement, that's kind of softened. think there was also tension among drivers, right, as they weren't sure, right, whether or not this intimidation was going to stay or go away. So it wasn't clear. They didn't have the power there to bargain against law enforcement agents. And so at some point, we saw almost 3,000 of our truckers just pack all together, right? So there was panic too on the transport side. Some of them, 4 weeks ago, took the last journey home down to the north to see how their families were doing, right? Because they didn't just want to kind of fully engage. So there's been pressure, right, on the supply side, right? I think much more than on the demand side. But we're seeing that kind of level up as the government has communicated more, as we've engaged more with the government, and we're seeing that trend begin to reverse back to normal now.
Fascinating. I think one of the key sort of things that's most interesting to me about this moment is the regional opportunity that it represents for us. And so globally, you can see sort of the concerns that people had when China kind of was on lockdown and people were ordering goods from Chinese factories and they were worried about, and sort of the delays got started. You can hear this in America with people worrying about the delivery time for goods on Amazon, or sort of the shortening of the unavailability of goods. And my sense, I think the opportunity for us across the continent is recognizing that if these disruptions happen in the future, and they will continue to happen. We know this is a major pandemic. It might be a 1 in a 100-year event, but it's probably not the last one we're going to experience, and there will be other disruptions. So I think there's a bit of a concern that people have about, well, how do we bulletproof ourselves, or if not bulletproof ourselves, at least reduce the exposure when there are sort of these global supply chain breaks. And so I think as two sort of companies that are focused on moving goods across the continent, are you hearing any of these kind of conversations, in terms of the way you think about expansion as companies? Do you have thoughts about moving goods across different countries within the continent? Do you have thoughts about sort of regional strategy, where the opportunities are? Tayo, I can have you start on that question.
Absolutely. So I think this is, there are two sides to this conversation. As you mentioned earlier, right, the African Free Continental Trade Agreement is going to be a key lever to unlock this. But I think that, COVID itself has begun to pose very interesting questions, like you mentioned, right? Like, how do we, number one, self-sustain as a continent? Because what you'd find, right, if you look at the entire continent today, is that there are lots of dislocations, right? So in some markets, you have just an excessive, production of goods, while in some other parts of the continent, you have just a deficit in, the availability of these goods, right? And so the question is, even before we look outside of the continent, how do we begin to, sustain ourselves, right, internally? And I think that, that's a key question that's being discussed now at different levels, right, within different stakeholders in the industry, right, today. And I think the government, right, is going to play a very key role, right, in enabling right policies, right regulations to ensure that you can unlock this supply of goods and ensure free trade. I think that also on the private side, right, even if all these resources and potential are unlocked, then you need, very strong logistics companies, like, who have the right technology, who have the right network, and able to facilitate this movement of goods, right? So there's a conversation ongoing there, and I think that, number one, there's going to be increased pressure, right, to think about self-sustenance, but it's also going to be, also thinking around tapping into these opportunities, because as we begin to open up, these regions and sectors and begin to identify the dislocations just within, right, because there are bulk of places where you kind of, meet, needs for goods and services across the continent today, that's going to itself, drive innovation and drive opportunities. And as this conversation among policymakers further, right, there's going to just be an opening up of, conversations around how the private sector and key players can, number one, tap into things like, processing along the value chain, right, production along the value chain, and very key, distribution along that chain. And we're on the spotlight there, staying very close to the conversations, engaging very closely, and looking forward to tap into these opportunities as they emerge. But I think the key statement from here is that COVID itself has created the opportunity to see these gaps, and there are clear inefficiencies that we could solve for, right, if we become more proactive and take advantage of this.
Fantastic. Leo, I think I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, so if you look at the structure of our both businesses, right, in terms of the setup, those regional hubs seem to the heart of our strategy. So we set up from Kenya, looking into Uganda, Tanzania, and that whole Eastern African hub. We set up looking into Ghana, the coastal routes of West Africa. This and then other expansion opportunities will be into Central Africa, where we already were making incursions before COVID-19 started. So the business case for the establishment of our both companies is to take and move both within countries and across countries. This is entirely from a Lorry point, which is what we set out to do and no more. And when we hit regulatory bottlenecks like the closure of the border in Nigeria and all of those things that tamper with these initiatives, it affects our business plan, because we now have to now do more in-country movements in West Africa and maybe look at cross-country movement in West Africa from other places, not in Nigeria. And the moment you take Nigeria out of the equation, you lose a very, very big part of the pie. And so we're hoping, right, that with the pressure on exchange rates, West Africa particularly will trade more with themselves. East Africa already does a lot of trading. Kenya, Uganda, they have those collaborations all the way to Tanzania and all. But West African countries, where the bulk of the volume actually is from a volume, a value, a number point of view. This does of industrial exchange rate risk across. Those conversations should ease border opening, should ease all of these initiatives that will drive.
Okay, it looks like we've lost Leo. We'll give him a few minutes to come back. I want to speak a little bit about a few things, and I'm going to say to the people in the audience who are watching this, if you're interested in sharing some thoughts about some of the questions that we're going to put out in a moment, please you can make a request for an opportunity to speak, basically attempt to share your video and audio. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the thoughts that we're having at TechCabal about this digital transformation moment. And if there are any people in the audience that want to respond, that have some thoughts around them, then I'll give you the opportunity to come on screen and speak a little bit about what you're thinking about. So again, our perspective on digital transformation at the moment is this idea of there is a long-term future we must build towards. And in order to build towards that future, there are some fundamentals that we must lay in place at the moment. And the opportunity in Africa is that if you look at a country like America, they have a lot of infrastructure that's years and years old, some of it hundreds of years old, some of it decades old. Whereas we have the opportunity to build new age infrastructure. And so I think the cobbles and the lorries are fascinating to me for applying technology to things which had very, very traditional approaches previously. So I look at the continent and I wonder, what are the essential infrastructure that needs to be put in place at this moment, that needs to be technologically driven? And for the tech entrepreneurs in the audience, for the people who are thinking, where do I deploy capital? Or the people who are thinking, where do I find capital? The question is, what do we need to build now? So some of the things we're thinking about are broadband obviously needs to get sorted so that people can join sessions like this without having some of the kind of interruptions that we're having. We need broadband much, much better distributed across the continent. Power is a traditional one. It needs to get sorted. Payments, which a lot of effort has gone into in the last few years, but still needs to get sorted from an interoperability perspective. So can you transfer money from Lagos to Cairo to Nairobi very easily? Can I buy goods in Kigali and pay for them seamlessly? So those are some of the things that we're thinking must be solved in this moment. And the forced adoption of digital by banks, by governments, by big companies, by small companies, the forced adoption of work from home is accelerating that from our perspective. And I'm curious if there are financiers, if there are investors in the audience, if you have thoughts about, look, I am going to deploy capital into this space in the near term because this is what to me seems like an immediate need, but a long-term opportunity, basically. There's some fields that are obvious winners in the immediate moment: health, pharma, edu, telco. Those are all getting big boosts at the moment. But what are the less obvious and more critical spaces? Still critical spaces. So health is obviously critical. Education is obviously critical. Payments are obviously critical. But what are the less obvious spaces that you are considering as sort of investors, as founders, as operators within this industry? So I'm going to take some of the people that I see here. I think Jules has been asking to speak for a while. So I'm going to see if we can add Jules and give him the opportunity to share some thoughts. I also see Oluwa Korede from Comestibles, and we'll see if we can give him an opportunity. No, actually, so he hasn't requested yet. Hi, Jules, how are you?
Hey, thanks for having me. Very good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. So you work for Cargo, which does logistics in Jakarta.
Work for Cargo, so logistics startup as well, very similar to you'd say Lori.
Well, you're ex-Jumia as well, I believe.
Oh, you're fast. Yes, exactly. I spent some time at Jumia in Egypt and Kenya, Morocco, a little bit before that.
Fantastic.
So I have a very keen interest in Africa, and I want to have a better picture of what's happening currently. I think we heard really good points of view from the two speakers here, and I was wondering more about what would be a good approach to actually not just have a passive approach, but a more proactive approach when you're looking at the current situation. So are you seeing any potential, for example, in certain traditional transporters being experiencing difficulties and maybe looking at organic growth over there or stuff like that? That's what I'm wondering.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to give Tayo the opportunity to speak to that. Tayo, what's your thinking?
Can you just reiterate quickly?
Yeah, the question is about how are you being proactive in this current situation? Maybe looking at inorganic acquisitions of traditional players, other things like that.
Absolutely. All right. So I think one thing we have done, right, is number one, to take a step back and just understand like where everyone sits, right, within the industry, right? And there are a few conversations that are ongoing, right, in terms of just understanding, what the structure looks like today and where the gaps are, right, in the market today. And like Leonard, rightly said, right, in the past, like a bulk of the transporters within our markets in Nigeria are still kind of like informal players within the market. So I think in terms of proactiveness, the things we're kind of thinking about, right, is to even begin to kind of solve headaches internally, right, before we begin to kind of extend this outside of the business. So some of the headaches, right, are things like, how can we get them to become, like bankable, right, or able to help them like solve some of these problems around like payments and money and transfer, right? So while everything that goes through our system is kind of electronic, right, some of them still want to kind of get that sophistication. And so we're thinking of, things like, how do we begin to help them in understanding financial services better? How do we help them begin to understand, fleet optimization better? How do we get them to begin to think about, expanding their fleet in a world where it's becoming increasingly difficult to import things, from places like Europe, right, or China, where they typically source trucks from, right? And I'll just kind of lay that as an example. So today we're using data that we've aggregated on the system over a couple of years, right, to understand, number one, right, like what are the pain points for these folks? Many of them are trying to expand their fleets. There are opportunities within the country, but they're not kind of going outside of this. And so what we're stepping is trying to help them, number one, like be more organized with payments and their finances, and also helping them, right, working with financial institutions to arrange, asset financing based on just data that we have.
There's definitely it's a good opportunity to push for that. I think we're seeing that in a lot of cases.
Thanks, Jules. I'm going to give someone else the opportunity to join us, but thank you for joining us today from
Thanks
Jakarta.
so much. Thanks so much. Bye.
Okay. Hi, Wiza.
Wiza from Nairobi. I wanted to just highlight the significance of the role that physical addressing plays in this infrastructure layer. And in many of the African countries, like Nigeria specifically, I know it's quite difficult in most areas. Here in Nairobi, we have a startup called OKHi, and they give you like a short word-based address that is meant to represent your physical coordinates. And I think that's like super critical at a time where a lot of the urban areas in these African capitals are moving towards like delivery orientation. So it becomes very critical for developers or e-commerce firms to be able to easily plug in some sort of a location that is relatable, especially because I think save for South Africa and Egypt, a lot of African countries don't use physical addresses for physical deliveries. So I think that's something that's a huge opportunity that not a lot of people are paying attention to, but it also has some serious challenges when you think about like how do we actually monetize that model? Like, do I pay a service like OK Hi for having a physical address, or is it the responsibility of the government to give me a physical address? I'd be curious to hear thoughts from the panelists around like, what are the long-term solutions towards the physical addressing challenge in Africa, and what are the interesting solutions that you've seen deployed so far? Thank you.
Thanks, Wiza. I think that's a really interesting sort of set of questions. Leo, I'd love to get your take on this.
So our approach at Laurie, particularly for Nigeria, where you're right, these kind of issues exist, is to walk around it. So what is the essence of my business? What am I trying to do? I'm trying to get cargo from point A to point B, which means I need to have cargo. The client owners all have physical addresses. I need to have trucks. My model is such that the nearest available truck should pick up the nearest available cargo, which means that at full maturity, I really don't need to know the owner or the transporter. He just needs to be logged onto my platform for me to just match him to that nearest available cargo. So the interaction between us and him then becomes payment. Fortunately for us, we do a due diligence on transporters, which includes your payment details. Whichever payment form you wish to use, we are amenable to paying you using those means. And because we literally upfront our transporters in terms of funding their OPEX for the trip, so from them the risk, the financial money, and all of these things. So that's the workaround that we have. Now, whether that is sustainable or not is a debate to have, because that imposes huge operational costs on my side. I need to bear the financial risk for the movement. I need to bear the risk in terms of the cargo itself, in terms of GIT and all that. So essentially the risk in the value chain, our business model takes most of it. And so the debate internally is whether we take enough in terms of profit for the level of risk that we take. And it's an academic conversation, really, because to be able to get these traditional people to a point where they understand the real value you provide, and they become, in a sense, addicted to that kind of system that Taylor talked about, the impact of it on their business in terms of the monthly return per truck, to see the ease to do business with big companies that require huge governance structures that they can never meet. But by latching onto our platform, we have eased all of that for them. You will need to bear this kind of cost, this kind of risk over businesses like ours run on cash. So the workaround is to have sufficient cash and have sufficient cash management in terms of collection and recycling your existing cash to bridge this chain. And this is where we are in Nigeria. At the center of my thinking, there is some level of collaboration that needs to happen between the big players in the industry to better drive that.
Fascinating. I also really like that phrase. TechCabal team and audience, please take note of Leo's contention that there must be collaboration. We'll be investigating that and following that conversation. Wiza, I'm actually going to throw your question back at you in a sense, because I've heard the question around addressing systems across the continent for years now. I mean, I've probably heard at least 4 to 5 startups in this space, different solutions. So it's a really interesting challenge. And I think to speak to a little bit of what Leo said is the question of when you're building a new and innovative solution, what is the profit opportunity in it? And I mean, you're in product, you develop product and you think about this. What is the profit opportunity? Where does that profit come from? Is the government going to fund your new addressing system, or is it going to be so useful for Kobo and Lori that they are going to pay you for it? And so there's a little bit of kind of chicken and egg, and where is the revenue? Where is the opportunity? Which is why we need long-term capital, because we need sort of people who have a long view. But we also need entrepreneurs who can think about and solve these kinds of problems. I'm going to ask you your thoughts about this, and at the same time, I'm going to add someone here, Marian Okundairo, who works for PwC. I might also have some thoughts. But what's your thinking about this? Like, how do you think about this?
Yeah, I think the long-term sustainable model is to move the cost onto the merchant, right? So I'm talking specifically about the last mile. Leonard, I do appreciate all of the points you raised, but perspective, it really seems as though that addresses it from the supply side for businesses like Lori and other people. But I'm talking about like last mile services. Wiza is in his house and he has ordered some food or has ordered a parcel and you want it to get to him. I think that the way of making these models sustainable is to move the cost onto the merchant, that cost burden onto the merchant, because at the end of the day, if I order some food from you, Tomiwa, I don't care how you get it to me. What I want is for the food to be in my house. So if there's a provider that is giving you a technical solution to be able to much more easily locate me in an environment where physical addressing infrastructure isn't a thing, then I think that you can bake that into your own unit economics as part of the delivery fee. So I live in Nairobi, and over the past month or so, pretty much everyone that I know in my area has moved to like deliveries. I'm actually expecting 2 deliveries right now. This is my delivery rider calling me. And granted, here in Nairobi, I do have a physical address because I live in one of the more refined areas. But like, if we're to adopt e-commerce at scale, especially for people closer to the bottom of the pyramid, if you go to slum areas, for example, they don't have physical addresses. So I think there needs to be some sort of like industry-wide collaboration, maybe some sort of interoperable, inter-accessible database of locations that people can that merchants can pay for to subscribe to. But so far, I see that all the players are doing it in isolation. I know of What 3 Words. What 3 Words are pretty big in South Africa and a little bit of Europe, but not very much in East Africa. And I think it's because there's no localized solutions, and they're not being promoted collaboratively. Sorry, I need to answer my delivery rider, so I'm going to go on mute.
All right, thanks for joining us, Wiza. I'm going to let you go. We'll bring you back on later if necessary. Hi, Marianne, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, hello. So I'm just, go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
No, go ahead, please.
No, just a point of correction. I don't actually work for PwC anymore. I'm a business strategist, digital business strategist, and I work as a consultant. And my last project was with PwC, where I worked on an artificial intelligence projects, and I've worked on digital transformation. I'm in the UK, by the way.
Okay, yes,
Yeah, so,
I saw that.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to ask you broadly, what are your thoughts around sort of this digital transformation moment, globally and on the continent? I mean, I saw that.
So on the content, obviously, I'm looking to you guys for more steering. That's one of the things I think that those of us in diaspora and those of us inside can work together so we can see what's happening on the outside and also what's happening on the inside, right? So globally, we've touched on a number of things already, which are quite significant, which is it's a level playing field right now, okay? So digital transformation, I work in the tech. I've always been in technology. So we've always actually been a way ahead of everybody else, right? So now we've got to this point. I've been trying to convince my clients, my individual clients, to say, look, you need to go digital for quite some time, but now we don't need to convince anybody anymore. Everybody knows, okay?
Everybody's learning.
We all agree with that, exactly. So the thing is, I think it was, was it doing on the previous presentation that you had that said, like Nigeria needs things like painkillers, not vitamins, right?
Yeah.
So when we're looking at the digital landscape, when you look at it this way, the way it's progressed, right? There's a progression which people are not actually looking at. And I've given some presentations myself in this whole COVID period as well. And first of all, the first wave of it was going from analog to digital. So if you look at newspapers, right? They went from newspapers and going online and started doing online. And then from there, we started having all this smart cities, smart mobile, smart home, smart everything. So you have the Alexas and the Siris and being smart. And that's we have digital, and that's digitalization, where we're actually digitalizing our business models. We're changing the way we work, the business models and the processes. And somebody was saying earlier on as well that we might have to change channels, we might have to change products, So we're looking at the whole business model. How do we actually create value? And then we're moving on now in the West. They're already moving on to cognitive things where you have people like Sophia, that's a robot. Leo, I'm sure you know this as well. The robots and everything where they're becoming cognitive. And it's actually quite scary and quite dangerous, if we want, but we're not talking about that anyway, because we have opportunities, but it's also scary. So my view on this is, yes, I think that the approach that we have like in Nigeria is, or in African countries, is that we have a lot of challenges, which are like you mentioned some of them, the logistics, like in terms of like power, there were 3 of them that you mentioned,
Power,
So we need to deal with
Broadband.
those things first,
Yeah,
right? But when you're entrepreneurs, SMEs, for example, they don't have the capital, right, to deal with digital on a large base, but they have the brain power, they have the innovation. So what's happening in the large companies is that they're collaborating with smaller companies and have incubators where they just, in companies, what they have is they just have departments that are just bring any idea. No idea is rubbish. Just bring them. So they're working with people that cannot actually not have the capital for research and development, right? And Nigeria, for example, Africa, they have a very young population. They have intelligent people. Yeah. The downfall for me personally, when it comes to Nigeria, is the infrastructure, pulling together, everyone working together collaboratively. But if it's in terms of like the brilliance, the manpower, the education, people, even on the streets, you go to the streets, you see these kids, they make all sorts of things. You guys know that. So we need to pull we need to start pulling that brain power in and bring them into organizations that can afford and just have like an area, like an incubator, just put them in there somewhere, you pay them, they come up with all sorts of ideas, and then you start to research. That's what these companies are doing. That's what they did in this large organization. Every large organization, because I worked with the 4 consultants, the major ones as well, they're all doing it. And that's where collaboration comes in. And then the other thing as well is the way we run our projects. We can't run projects in the Prince 2 that way anymore. Technology in the last 2 years has moved at a faster speed than it has in the last 26 years. So we can't be running Prince 2. Somebody said that again, I think on the last presentation, where it was like, we've got to a point where now we have to think long term, but implement short term. That's what it's fail fast, agile, scrum, agility, where we run our projects now. We can't be planning those big things. The other point I want to make is that people go, oh, digital. Other people are going digital, even SMEs. And I tell them, you have to have a business. The fundamental business principles of having a proper business model still apply. Yeah. Because you're applying your digitalization to your business model. You may have to tweak your business model. You may have to pivot. You may have to look at your partners. Who am I dropping? Who am I keeping? What channels am I using? Do I need this? Or, you might just have to get credit, but you're still applying it to the fundamental principles of business still work. And and lastly, I know I've made a number of points here. Lastly, the other point I'd like to make is that everything we do, whether you come from a product perspective or you come from the customer, is all based around the customer. It's how do we create value? How do we increase revenue, reduce waste, but we're creating more value for the customer. Customers, they got very low attention spans right now. They go to a website, if they don't understand what you're doing, they're out of there quickly. They have too many choices, right? So what we want to do is making the customer experience better. And as digitalization or whatever it is moving, we want to make sure that we're moving and we're helping, because otherwise they take their business somewhere else. And then the government have a place, but the entrepreneurs, I think that the entrepreneurs definitely are the ones building economies and building nations. The government, it's a very long discussion. It's not the platform, but we have to work together in tangent. So large companies, small companies, the government, the private sectors. We need to understand the customers. Keep on researching the customers, see what they want, and see how. Because before I've come here, look at it's out of digitalization now. I mean, in those days, first of all, we can't talk like this. And secondly, you even say, oh, Marion, that works on PwC. You've already got some information from me. Before you get onto any platform, people are tracking you. They know what you want. Oh, he likes green. I'll put that in front of him. And that's the way things are moving. So we need to actually create for the customer so that we can keep up to date. And I know that we're not quite there on the continent, but there are ways that we can get there. And this is something I'm very passionate about.
I can tell. Thanks, Marianne. I'm going to, I'll speak to a few of the things that you've mentioned. There are a couple of people that have been waiting to speak, so I'm going to bring them on. But thank you for joining us. I think it definitely speaks to the moment we're in, that you're joining us from London. I don't know if you've attended or would have attended any of the other TechCabal events as easily. But I think speaking to a few points that sort of Marianne has made, while also adding Korede from Comestibles, I think some of the questions that Marianne mentioned, sort of around the idea of bringing bright brains into companies, as well as the need for sort of strong business models. I mean, we've got Tayo here, we've got Leo here, and I think it was Leo that mentioned that some of the reasons he joined Lori was because the opportunity there was to solve sort of a fundamental problem within the structure of a business that sort of had an opportunity. there are lots of bright brains running around the continent, but business models that are scalable and have fundamental sort of like interest to consumers are hard to find. Investors who will take a chance on those businesses are critical. And so you need to kind of find businesses that are strong enough and are robust enough. And I think one of the things that's been critical for the growth of our ecosystem, and that's important for people to consider as they look at what problems will I solve, is the problem big enough for me to solve on my own? Are the opportunities for me to get capital to solve this problem really there? Or do I join people who are already solving a big problem and become part of a strong team kind of tackling a major problem? I think those are sort of like critical things that people need to think about in deciding, do I go and start something and solve a problem on my own, or do I join an existing effort and strengthen it? So that's big. I think that's really big around sort of thinking about where our talent goes and what business models it is that get pushed forward. Korede, thanks for joining us. Korede is the CEO of Comestibles, which is in the digital food supply chain. So what's your question?
Yeah, so I think many already answered a part of my question. So I know Laurie and probably Kobo help move food products across the country. And I know due to the current situation of COVID-19, safety of food will be of high priority. So I was going to ask a question around how are they ensuring that, okay, there's minimal contact between the offloading and when doing the process of offloading and unloading the food products onto the truck so that there's minimum contact, so you don't have this virus staying on food products and it getting across to people through that means. So that was my question.
Thanks for joining us, Korede. I'm going to let Leo tackle that question, and I'm going to take you off now so I can add some other people.
Okay.
But thanks for coming through. Leo?
Okay, so I put an answer in the chat already. So that for material hasn't changed. If anything, there has been additional requirement based on NSCDC requirements and WHO requirements for GMP in organizations that we serve. And so because we serve majorly FMCGs and established companies on the supply side, those requirements are fully met on side. And because the traditional side has been shut down, there's no risk coming from non-compliance on that side. So the food safety point of view, as a result of COVID-19.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks, Leo. Hi, Tyre. How you doing?
Oh, mic check. I'm well. Good.
Excellent. How's it going? How are things at Utiva? I'm actually glad to have you on board because education is obviously one of the areas that's sort of critical at this time.
Gotcha.
And so it's interesting. I'd like to know, what are you guys seeing and what is your vision? Sort of what is the long-term play? What are the short-term actions for you?
Mm-hmm. Very, very broad conversation, right? And I'm quite very excited. I mean, I see the silver lining. So there's a part of me that is very excited because the challenge has forced, ecosystem players to begin to look at this other end of the spectrum. I mean, people are now considering talent development, especially because of the supply side of things that is shrinking. Companies are now looking to downsize and also scale the very important talent that they need to compete right now. So one of the things that I see people come to me with almost every minute is, I'm looking for a product manager that can work from home because I have a product that I'm building. I'm looking for a product designer that can work from home. And the conversation is also changing. But just to put a little bit of perspective to where we are currently, to be honest, it's a very challenging time for the people that we serve. Every day we get a lot of people that are looking to learn premium technology skills, saying, "Hey, I've been fired. I just lost my job, and I want to learn." The interesting thing is that companies are also becoming more proactive. So we're also getting organizations that are saying, "Hey, I don't have a choice than to downsize, but can I give like a training voucher to some of the people that I'm downsizing and getting them to learn new skills as I'm releasing them?" So it's like the conversation is a little bit, changing. So I would say that number one, it's very challenging right now for the B2B side of things and the B2C side of things, especially the customers that we're looking to help upskill because people are losing their job. But just speaking of silver lining, the interesting thing is that as an organization in the education space, especially organizations that are playing in the education technology space, I also see my fellow, colleagues in that same industry are beginning to adapt. You speak of Covenworks, so you talk of University and some other organizations that we are playing in the same ecosystem are adapting very fast and reinventing, the value delivery model, and also looking at better ways of capturing values for their customers. I mean, for us, for instance, our staff strength some sort of increased by almost 25% because we saw a very huge gap and we had to quickly jump in that gap. And that's like a recent graduate gap, and we had to quickly hire more people so that we can, provide services. But speaking in terms of the future and what I see, the honest reality is that nothing will really change in terms of the pressure on Africa. By 2030, we are still going to have almost 600 million people that will be ready to get into the job market. 37% of them will be less than 25 years. So the challenge is still the same. The challenge that the universities are churning out graduates that don't have the skills, and almost 3.3 million jobs are left unfilled at the entry level because people don't have the skills to fill them. But the future of work is really going to change. And when I talk about the future of work now, I mean the future of work for Africa. Because we are not used to remote work. We don't have the infrastructure to power people working from home. The new dynamics, we don't have the capabilities. It's like we're not prepared for these. I have a team that works from home, and I still hear children make noise at the background. So I hear mothers of my staff members say, "Tolu, will you go and fetch water for me?" And the guy is actually supposed to be working from home because we are not prepared for this new dynamic. So it's like a new conversation around how do we as talent developers now begin to help people like you that are running technology companies move a little beyond training people in tech skills and now moving a lot more into the soft skills that you need to power those tech skills, understanding that the new dynamics will change the way tech is also organized. So we're launching more leadership training now because we know that people would have to work from home. We're launching more emotional intelligence training because we know that depression is going to increase. People are feeling isolated from their colleagues. We're launching, people learning how to work remotely. We're launching different trainings in all these new clients because we realize that it's going to be a little beyond just tech skills. Communication, a product designer would have to work with you, not from the office. So the person needs to learn to communicate problems, right? Because it's no more you tapping the developer and saying, "Let me see what you're doing." The developer is going to be working from home this time. So, and we don't know how long this is going to happen. And I'm hearing most companies saying, we're not going back to the norm. So we have a challenge to do that. And also there's a lot of challenge at the back end. We have to keep developing people with tech capabilities. And we also need to make sure that we also be helping people to learn the leadership capacity and the soft skills to power the tech skills that they have. I mean, I can go on and on. It's quite a very exciting
time. So we have a few more minutes. I do want to bring Kola on. Thank you for joining us, Tayo.
Pleasure. Good to have you.
Okay, so I've got Kola joining us in a second. I'm also going to bring on Sean Oyegunle, who's also been waiting for a moment. I think we're in our final few minutes of this call. Have we lost Kola again? Here's Kola. Hi, Kola.
Hi. I've got another call that's literally starting now, but I just wanted to hold on to answer that question.
Okay, please.
Efosa and I, out of the Prosperity Paradox, had a debate a few days ago about the same question, right? And I think ultimately, I used to think that if we're going to do this at scale and fast enough for what needs to happen, government needs to come to the table. And so I guess my new sort of retort is the future of Africa will be built by entrepreneurs if governments will let them.
Yeah. I think I have heard you say that.
Yeah. So get out of the way or just make it easier. And this is why we either have to get them on our side or get involved in governance ourselves.
I think I 100% agree with that. 100%.
Yeah. That's the unfortunate reality, because if not, it's just going to be pockets of change. If we want to see large scale change, government has to get in the room.
Okay. Fantastic. Thanks again for joining us, Kola. We'll let you get on to your call, but you're coming back.
Yeah.
I think we have it's our last few minutes. Tayo, is there anything else you'd like to share with the team? Leo, Tayo first.
So I think lots of great thoughts out there. I think the case is fundamental and clear to everybody. I think one, there's clear need for government participation, right? We're at a point where investments, right, in the tech space would only thrive if you have the right policy environment, you have the right regulations, and then you also have the right base infrastructure, right, like roads, right, like accessible broadband. Today, not everyone can access these services, right? And that opens up the door for innovation around building, platforms. They even have the best platforms in the world, right? Within this economy, right, or within the continent, until you increase the access, you cannot, fully increase adoption, right? I think there also needs to be a case for also digital education, right? There are lots of folks who have very nice phones, but don't even know how to kind of monetize them or use them. So I think the case for education is extremely fundamental, right, across board, given the fact that we still have, large informality. I think there's also a huge case for investing in that infrastructure. That'll be the layer on top of which people will innovate. And I think that there's also a case for driving the right policies, right? So no one is going to do this alone. It's going to be a collaboration between the government and investors, private sector players, and between private sector players and themselves to make sure that this dream comes to pass.
Okay, so
yeah.
So from my side, I'll take it from Amandla's report. The outlook for Nigeria looks gloom, but the outlook for logistics in Nigeria is flashing really bright colors right now. Those that invested in the lorry and Kobos of this world invested in the promise that we can move from pure traditional to a little bit of blue collar, white collar, right? Now we have established ourselves as being able to do just that. And with the advent of COVID, it has sold that message to the more traditional people that this is really the way to go. And so there is no better time to put your money in a logistics business like ours than now, because we have set the base to just simply fly. So investors, bring your $200 million, $1 billion. We are good hands to invest in right now.
Selling. You should stay around with MFA Capital later on, because they've got serious money, but they're looking to put it into work. So thank you so much, guys, for coming onto this session, and thank you for everybody who contributed. I apologize, there are one or two people that I couldn't get to, but I appreciate all of those who were able to contribute to us.